If you're watching this video, it means you're ready to move on to your still life project. So let's start by finding our objects. Right here, I have a collection of various objects that I found around my house that I think I can use for a still life. In order to narrow this down to just 3, we want to think about what sort of theme can we tell, or what kind of story can we tell with our objects. Right now I see a common theme between the mugs that I have, as well as the coffee can. All of them are coffee related, and together they remind me of waking up in the morning with a good cup of coffee, with a golden morning sun, and a nice breeze rolling through the window. So I'm going to try and take those 3 objects and create an interesting still life. So let's just remove the ones we don't need. And you can start to move your objects around, thinking about placement. And keep in mind those rules of making a good composition, such as rule of thirds, overlapping, contrast, movement, and focal point, and so on. So when thinking about contrast, like if I put those 2 next to each other, they're pretty similar in value. One's not going to make the other one pop out as interesting. But if I put the blue one next to the yellow one, the contrast between the blue and the yellow really emphasizes the objects. When you have a composition you think looks good, begin to think about how you're going to arrange it on your paper. So if we turn our paper sideways in landscape, how is that going to look compositionally? If your phone has a camera, you can use that as a viewfinder. And then once you have a good composition, you can take a photo of it for a reference later. So thinking about our rules of composition, the reason I chose this still life arrangement, I have strong contrast between this dark area on the cup next to the light area on the yellow canister. I have movement from the mug on this side, moving up to the tall can, and then back down to the shorter mug, forming a triangle, which is a strong compositional object. Also, you'll notice that all 3 of my objects are overlapping in some sort of way, which creates strong visual interest. So now that we have a still life arrangement set up, let's go ahead and start sketching this onto our drawing paper. Let me explain my layout. Right here, I've taken half my drawing paper to work with. I have with me a drawing pencil and an eraser. I have my still life over to the side of me. And I also have my phone, which has a picture of my still life, so I can think about composition. And to prepare my paper, I'm going to take a ruler and I'm going to make a 1-inch border all around my paper. This will give me a little bit of wiggle room when I go to actually draw my still life. If you don't have a ruler, you can use the width of 2 of your fingers and measure that along the edges of your paper. Make marks, and then connect those marks using a straight edge. Okay, so I've defined my workspace. So let's get started on this drawing. First, we want to lay out a general guide for where we have positioned our pieces in our still life. So I know I have a mug right in this area. I have the can back in here. I have that second mug over in this area. Now all my forms can be broken down into very basic shapes. Specifically, each one is a cylinder. So I can go ahead and map those in. So we have the top of our red cylinder over here. Make sure to draw very lightly because you do not want these showing up in your final composition when you add colored pencils. We're just getting a very general layout of our shapes. The can we see in the back is more of, we know it's a cylinder, but from what we can see, it looks like a big rectangle with a slightly curved bottom. And for composition, I'm going to try and get that lid to be falling off the top of our picture plane right in here. When we have elements touching the edges of our picture plane, that makes a much more interesting composition than if they're all floating on the inside. So finally we have our blue mug. And we see, looking at our still life, the top of our blue mug is about the same height as our red mug. So we know that the top of our blue mug should reach this point here. Put a little dot. So I know that's where the top of my circle should go. We can do that for the bottom too. Our blue mug goes at about the same level as our red mug, maybe just a little bit lower. Just filling that in with our ellipse. Alright, and then we have the edges of our mug. So that's our very general layout. I just want to add in things like the handles to our mugs. So here we have another example of an element coming off the edge of our picture plane. That handle just runs right off and we don't even see the other end. Be sure to mark in anything in the background. This is where our table meets our wall. Our next step is blocking in areas of color and value. So we can see in our still life that our light source is on the top left coming in. Here's a photo of my setup. As you can see on the left side, I have a light pointing directly at my still life objects. So we know that on the left sides of our objects, we're going to have our highlights, and then moving towards the right side, we will have our base tones. So let's start with our red mug on the right. We have a cast shadow coming off of our handle and coming down to the bottom of our mug. We also have a cast shadow coming down from our bottom of the handle to that same point. And again, coming up right in this corner here. So now we have this shape here that we know is one value. So when we go in with colored pencils, we can easily fill this space in. So we have the top of our cast shadow over here, coming down to about this point, and this moves up ever so gently as part of that transition from our mid-tone into the base tone. So we can even lock in this area so that we know that we have slightly different areas of value. Around the brim of our mug, we have that sliver of highlight. And that even starts to wrap around to the back of the mug. As we can see right in here, there's a transition between a darker and a lighter element. We have a highlight right on our handle, as well as a bit of a highlight on the top. So we're going to continue this process across each of our forms, just defining the areas of value as they transition across the surfaces of our still life objects. We can also see there's a cast shadow from our handle on the table here, as well as one hidden back. But that's good because that again crosses into our side of the picture plane. So now we can move into the yellow can in the back here. The can itself has these grooves along it, so we can define those. As you can see, the top half has a cast shadow and the bottom half has a highlight. So having that immediate contrast is definitely going to create some interest in our composition. Now I'm not paying attention to the decals that are on these items here, such as what's going on right in the center of that can with the logo, or the decals that are on this blue mug that would be over here. Right now I just want to focus on the areas of value and getting these objects to look as realistic as I can. So we have a sliver of a highlight over in this area here. We have a base tone that ends right about here. Our mid-tone is right at that center. Quarter tone fills in this space in here. And this area would be the highlight, but that's going to be all in yellow. So now we have some notes to work off of once you start adding in those colors. We know what areas need to be really dark, which areas need to be lighter, we can see our transition of value all across the face of the yellow can in the back. And we have different areas of strong and subtle highlights along our blue mug. Now when you go in to add color, be sure to remember use complementary or even analogous color schemes in order to create smooth transitions and very rich value. I'm going to show you a color drawing I did earlier as an example. So here we have the same elements in the still life I was just working off of. I have very rich, very deep darks for that shadow inside the mug, as well as the shadow that comes off of the handle. I've created a transition of value all across the surface of the yellow can. For the backdrop, I decided to take the liberty of adding in color. I wanted to create more contrast between forefront elements and our background. So I went with a transition of purple and blue all the way into a lighter blue over on this side. The contrast between our purple and our yellow makes the figures pop out at us. So when you get started, remember, you want to create a strong composition using techniques including the rule of thirds, overlapping, contrast, and movement. Use your fingers or your phone as a viewfinder so you get an idea of where you're going to be composing these elements on your paper. Create a nice border for yourself so you're not running all the way to the edge of the paper. Start with very general layouts for your elements and break down each object into smaller, simpler forms such as cylinders, spheres, and cubes. Then start to block in those areas of color and value to make it much easier for yourself when you add those colors in. When you start to add colors in, be sure to use things like complementary and analogous colors in order to create a wider range of value. All right, get started, and I can't wait to see what you come up with.